All right, what's up, Pooh? Communist Necessity. Never read this before. Heard other Maoists read it before in my life, so we'll figure this out together. Communism, we know, is a word to be used with caution. Not because in the grand parade of words, it may no longer be very fashionable, but because our worst enemies have used it and continue to do so, certain words are like battlegrounds. Their meaning, revolutionary or reactionary, is a victor to be torn from the jaws of struggle, the invisible committee. Yesterday, we had nothing. Today, we have two great historical experiences, rich in lessons, experiences which are present, which are alive in us. We must insist that the fact that there have been two restorations does not deny that the revolution is the main trend. To deny this fact is a pipe dream of reactionaries because the world proletarian revolution continues to advance, and we are a part of that advance. It is undeniable that the world proletarian revolution will demand the cost of bloodshed, but what does not demand the cost of blood in in this world? We ourselves would not be here without the lives sacrificed by so many communists and revolutionaries. The Peruvian Communist Party. Overture. We're going to read the overture. Bring up Hannah. Overture. The leftist milieu in North America and Europe has now reached a point where the momentumists of the late 1990s is approaching its limits. Following the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, China's descent into state capitalism, and the degradation of abandoned and small socialist satellite states such as Cuba, the left at the privileged centers of global capitalism enter a new area of chaos, unwilling to accept that capitalism was the end of history, while at the same time believing that communism was a failed project. Leftist organizations dealt with their confusion by their disintegrating and distance themselves from the past. If the history of actual existing socialism was indeed proved itself to be a grand failure, then the only hope for the activists of the 1990s was to discover a new way of making revolution. In those days, when fragile affinity groups embraced contingencies and chaos in the hope that this disorganized method would somehow produce revolution, we imagined we are building something new. We are incapable of understanding what all we are doing was uncritically replicated past methods of organizations that had already revealed their ineffectiveness prior to the spectacular failure of communism. We return to anarchism without reflecting on the anarchist limits of the Spanish Revolution. We return to disorganization without understanding all of this incoherent current of socialism that had failed to build anything beyond utopian speculations. We refuse to think through the problems of the state, forgetting the limits encountered by the communards of Paris. Incapable of understanding the precise meanings of the communist failure, we end up repeating the past while imagining we were building something new. In 1999, protests against the World Trade Organization in Seattle, the mobilization against the 2001 Free Trade Areas of the Americas Summit in Quebec City, in 2001, G8 protests in Genoa. These were the high points of the anti-globalization movement. Together, along with other explosive movements of angry first world resistance, these struggles demonstrated a belief that innumerable and disconnected movements could topple capitalism, that their fractured efforts would intersect and amount to a critical breaking point. Even this practice would collide with the facts of highly organized and militarized states that, unlike the chaotic activists challenging the power of capitalism, were more than capable of pacifying discontent. This was a momentumist, the assumption that specific social movements, sometimes divided along lines of identity or interest, which could reach a critical mass and together without any of that Leninist nonsense in capitalism. By the time of the 2010 G20 summit in Toronto, this anti-capitalist methodology had already become a caricature of itself. The confrontation were echoed as tragedy or farce, where there was a tired recognition that nothing could be accomplished, and the militants arrested were guilty only of demanding the right to protest. All of the high points, if they were indeed high points, in 1991 and 2001 were repeated in the tired and banal manner. The state remained unharmed. The activists resisting the state were punished. Before this farce, the coordinating committee of the 2010 demonstrations were absurdly maintained to multiple email list services that we were winning, and yet it could never explain what it meant by, quote, we, nor did its claims about winning, quote unquote, make very much sense when it was patently clear that a victory against the G20 would have been more than a weekend of protest. We had truly reached a point where victory was nothing more than a successful demonstration. Where we simply succeeded in defending the liberal right to assembly. After all, it would be bizarre to assume that the people's responsibility for this triumphalist language actually believe that world imperialism would be defeated that weekend. They had already dampened their expectations, and when they spoke of winning, they were simply demonstrating a defeatist acceptance of lowered stakes. Those who refused to recognize 2010 as a caricature, who continue to argue that this organizational form and strategy is the only way forward. We like the hippies of the 1960s behind the Times focus on their, quote, glory days. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, myopic in their inability to look beyond the boundaries of their time and space. They refuse to examine the past revolutions, just as they refuse to examine the revolutionary movements of today, in those zones that they claim to defend against imperialism, that had never been enamored with the momentumist praxis. They are willing to settle for reformism and pretend that it is revolution, acting as if a successful defense of the right of assembly and the ability to make one's complaint heard are the only victories the movement can achieve. In order to make sense of our impasses, we adopted new theories of organization, anything that did not resemble the failures of the past, desperately hoping we could find the holy grail that would make another world possible. We ventured out into theoretical terrains we believed were exciting because of the whirlwind jargon some theorists employed. We spoke of, oh my gosh, I do not know this word. I wonder if it's going to let me say it. Are you going to let me say it?
In order to make sense of our...
Of course not. All right, I gotta go look up this word because I don't know what it means. spoke of. Hold on a second, everybody. So it's Rizal, and it means I took a screenshot instead. There we go. Let me get that up for you. Effects. I've done this. Why did it do that? Effects. There we go. Okay. So Rizal, a continuous growing horizontal underground stem, which puts out lateral shots and advantageous roots at intervals. That's what that word means. Interesting. And bloom of territorialization of the magnitude of anything that did not completely resemble the old-fashioned jargon that sank to a failure. What is going on here? We're having another person come in. No. Okay, never mind. And yet our failures were not even world historical. We failed long before reaching those moments and grand failure that had disciplined us into adopting these alternative practices of rebellion. We are not even capable of replicating the failures of the Paris Commune, let alone the failures of Russia and China. We did nothing but protest, sometimes militantly, agitating without any long-term plans, fantasized that our activism was synonymous with revolution. Meanwhile, even before we embarked upon this confused path of social movementism, people's wars were being launched in those zones we claim to represent under the auspices of the theory we had assumed was dead. Incapable of looking beyond the boundaries of our own practice, we often refuse to recognize these movements, cherry-picking those movements of resistance that resemble our own practice. Instead of the Sendero Luminoso, we championed a particular narrative of the Zapatistas. Instead of Nepal, we focus on Venezuela. Instead of the Naxalites, we lewd the Arab Spring, processing the privilege to ignore everything that did not resemble our supposedly new way of seeing the world. We dismissed anything that could teach us otherwise. But now, some of us whose experiences is of this banal failure have taught us that if another world is possible, it is only possible by abandoning the methods promoted by the anti-globalization movement, are beginning to question the normative anarchism and the movementism that we once treated as common sense. The movementimist dream is crumbling. We are beginning to peer through its cracks. We are glimpsing the problem of revolutionary necessity and the need of organize in the matter that goes beyond the infantile methods of movementism. What is movementism? Let's find out what movementism is real quick. All right, so it is an AI overview. So here we go. Let me find it. It's on their effects. AR overview. of it says a movementism can refer to different concepts depending on the context, but if generally describes the approach that, oh my gosh, stop doing the things I don't want you to do. Jesus Christ. Depending on the context, but it generally describes the approach that prioritizes the movement over traditional political structures and can describe a political philosophy that emphasizes grassroots actions or specifically political ideologies. That movement conservatism of other contexts may describe a more decentralized and spontaneous style of activism that avoids rigid organization, instead focuses on going where the action is. All right. That's what that means, according to Google. Finally, the name communism is being revived at the centers of capitalism as part of an effort to reclaim a revolutionary heritage we abandoned. Although the revival is incomplete, there is a gap between name and concept. There is a refusal to recognize the communist revolutionary struggles that persisted in the global peripheries. There is an inability to grasp the dialectic of failure and success. First, the gap between name and concept. While there is an ongoing project amongst first developing world intellectuals and activists to reclaim the name communism, there are still only a few small steps made to reclaim the concepts this name once mobilized. The gap might demonstrate some confusion on the part of those who are dissatisfied with the anti-globalization variant of movementism, but are still uncertain of how to free themselves from this morass. This gap is in part due to the way in which our understanding of communism is filtered through the first world experience of history and social struggles. Most importantly, however, this gap intersects with a gap between theory and practice. Second, the refusal to recognize contemporary communist revolutions. Perhaps because of the first problem, we have an invariable Lucan. What's a Lucian? What is that word? It's lacuna. And lacuna means, if I can get it, means an unfilled space or interval, a gap. Okay. Sounds good. All right. Okay, do I have someone else on here? All right. Not getting too many gifts, though. All right. Where was I at? Where did I see that word? Why didn't I just highlight it? There it is. I'm going to do this again. Second, the refusal to recognize contemporary communist revolutions. Perhaps because of the first problem, we have a veritable lacuna of radical academic analysis when it comes to the experiences of contemporary people's war that have erupted and are still erupting outside the imperialist centers. When we do not denounce these revolutionary movements according to various conservative and liberal narratives, they are, quote, terrorists, aventurists, murderers, nihilists, etc. We simply pretend that they do not exist. Third, the inability to grasp the dialectic of failure and success. As noted, common sense and ideology has succeeded in presenting communism as a grand failure. Although we cannot escape the fact that past communist movement ultimately failed, this does not mean that they are not at the same time earth-shaking successes. If we can succeed in steering our way through the narrative of failure, we will be able to understand the revolutionary truth hard-won by the successes that may transcend these failures, and It is here where communism necessity will be discovered. Those of us who have struggled without communist ideology for decades are only beginning to make sense of the meaning of the name we once rejected. We are still trying to recapture our heritage. Chapter 1. Interesting. Chapter 1. 21st century communism. Finally, after decades of postmodernism and capitalist triumphalism, it is no longer considered impolite for academics of popular intellectuals to speak the word communism, for there was a time not long ago when we would have been seen as uncouth, or at least anarchistic, anachronistic. That's such a hard word. If we were to declare fidelity to, I'm going to actually look up that word. Where is it at? I'm going to look up this word. Just real quick. It's anachronistic. And that means, as soon as I find it, come on, belonging or appropriate to a period other than that being portrayed. Belonging or appropriating to an earlier period, especially so as to seem conspicuously old-fashioned or outdated. I think it's that one. All right. Back to the thing. Effects. Don't you dare. Anachronistic. Interesting word. Come on. All right, here we go. At least anachronistic. If we were to declare fidelity to a term that certain intellectuals fads had declared old-fashioned, tokenizing, violent. Until recently, we could escape from referring to ourselves as Marxists instead of as communists, but only so long as we did not hyphenate our Marxism with any of those suspicious names such as Lenin or Mao. Those people and movements responsible for applying Marxism and, in this application, declaring the world communism. Marxism, though passé, was considered toothless because it was only a theory, whereas communism was its possibly catastrophic application. And those who preserved this theory in the academic universe were often those who would never dare bridge the gap between theory and practice, content only to teach and sing the praises of Marxism, but never speak of communism except when they spoke of failure. It is as it turned out, very little was needed to convince many academics and intellectuals to be Marxist in theory rather than practice. The job security and tenure, liberal rights such as freedom of speech and publication contracts. He's talking about how the intellectuals won those things and became professionalism. And like they took on the petite bourgeoisie, tenures, liberal rights, such as freedom of speech and publication contracts. Like, yeah. In this context, those intellectuals who refused to abandon political practice, but who could not stomach the failed name of communism, would fall back into the more innocuous sounding socialism when they sought a label for their activities, a term that was once synonymous with communism, but that through the experience of the Great Revolution of the 20th century had come to mean something altogether different, became a fallback definition for those Marxists who would not remain content with inaction. This was a retreat, a sort back into a pure Marxism. Before Lenin, their concepts that should have been irrevocable transformed by world historical revolutions were reordered to resume their germinal status. A retreat from history, a retreat from development of revolutionary concepts won through class struggle. By the dawn of the 20th century, it had become vogue for the more daring first world Marxist academics and intellectual partisans to speak of, quote, 21st century socialism, end quote, as if they were identifying a new revolutionary moment. More than one book was written with this catchphrase embedded somewhere in its title and subtitle. More than one speaker at a mainstream demonstration banded about, and yet there was generally no consensus regarding its meaning. Some imagined that this new socialism was emerging in the momentous tide, I can't say the word, and the anti-globalization protest that began in Seattle. Others thought it was happening in the jungles of Mexico with the Zapatistas, AZLN. Others would eventually ascribe it to Chavez, Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, Venezuela, or some other left populist phenomenon in the Americas. Just what made this, quote, 21st century socialism, end quote, new or a product of the 21st century, though was rather unclear despite all attempts to make it seem apparent. It was more of a branding than anything else, it was more than a branding than anything else, an attempt to mobilize other and successive maxims. Quote, another world is possible, end quote. Quote, we are everywhere, end quote. End quote, the coming insurrection, end quote. That were always little more than slogans. And this nebulous fad avoided speaking of communism, of anything that would remind us of those significant decades in the 20th century that were seen as abject failures. This was the 21st century after all, and we would be old-fashioned and out of touch if we spoke of those moments without, oh my gosh, melancholy. He loves his words. But now, in the past 3 to 4 years, there has been a resurgence of the name that was banned. The name we are told was obsolete from the same quarters where it had been declared an anthem. Now we have academics and popular intellectuals speaking of communist hypotheses, communist horizons, and communist possibilities. What was once taboo in these spaces is now being pronounced openly, and these pronouncements are not destroying their the careers of those who make them. Quite the opposite, in fact. Some careers are being made by declaring fidelity of the name that was once banned. At the same time, however, this new intellectual trend is declaring the name communism cannot break from the previous periods of fearlessness, and so shares all the defects of nebulous speculation of the screeds of the 21st century socialism. Screeds. In many ways, this is just a substitution of one term for another, apparently more edgy because it now chooses to speak the name that was once forbidden. While it is true that there is an excitement in reclaiming a word that once frightened the capitalist order, this truth is toothless. It is nothing more than a name. Some would speak of communism as an idea or a hypothesis that existed for thousands of years, nearly wrenching it from those generations who died in the innumerable brave attempts to make it the catchword of the oppressed in the 20th century. In this sense, the world was dehistoriized, transformed into a platonic form in those instances of fear and trembling where it was elevated to great heights true from which it would fall, were treated as rapture moments to be remembered only for their nostalgic importance. Others would speak of communism as a far-off horizon, some distant point we could only glimpse, and thus more of an unborn desire for another and possible world. A dream communism, something we might approach if only we have enough faith or disorganized and rebellious movements to take us there on directionless tides. A communism across a great ocean, hidden like the lost island of Atlantis. Still, others speak of the world as a name that must be reclaimed because it makes the ruling class tremble. We must renew this name, we are told, because it is correct to vile ourselves in terminology our enemy despises, as if revolutionary action is a monstrous mask that will scare capitalism into retreat. At the same time, we are also told that renewing those traditions that provided us with the name, that handed us the important concepts through great sacrifice, should be avoided. Communization, quote unquote, rather than revolutionary communism of the past is the goal. Again, this is the 21st century, and we are supposed to find a new method, even if it must share its name with past movements. We are told that we cannot take anything from this past, because this past was only and can only ever be tragic. Despite a return to the name communism, there still appears to be a refusal to accept everything this name was supposed to mean, because we are told it meant mass murder, totalitarianism, and most unimportantly failure. We want to reclaim it. We might even want to argue against the Cold War discourse that speaks of mass murder and totalitarianism, just to set the record straight. But we have been convinced that the catastrophe of the 20th century communism means we must start anew, that we can learn nothing from the past except to ignore this past altogether. And that would go against Marxism, because Marxism is about historical materialism. Perhaps this refusal to reclaim communism is more than a name, due to the, quote, end of history, end quote, proclaiming when the Soviet Union collapsed, when capitalists imagined they were finally triumphant, and wanted to convince us that class struggles was antiquated. Here began a discourse about the class struggle as antiquated. Here began the discourse about communism, a discourse evinced by the rise of postmodern theory, where we are taught that to even speak the name communism was backwards, and that we should just accept that capitalism was, quote, the best of the worst, end quote. In this context, it is not surprising that the first academic attempts to reclaim the world was tentative. Better to hedge our bets and remake communism than speak more precisely of a theoretical tradition supposedly included when capitalist victory closed the historical chapter. And yet, despite this supposed, quote, end of history, communism as a revolutionary tradition never did go away. For though it might seem daring for academics and popular intellectuals at the centers of global capitalism to reclaim the world, communism has remained a vital necessity for individuals and movements living at the margins of both the world system and acceptable discourse. At the global centers, communists generally hid themselves within the labor and student movements, grudgingly accepted the terminology of socialism, and often practiced a fearful blankism. What's blankism? Let's find out what blankism, because I see that a lot. I think I know what it means, but just in case, let's look at blankism. Another AI overview. You're gonna have to forgive me for all the AI overviews, but that's what it's giving me. Sorry, everybody. And this might be not great. Let's find, not stickers. Blankism effect. Okay, blankism is a revolutionary doctrine named after the French socialist Louis Auguste Blanqui, I can't say the name right, that advocates for an overthrowing of existing governments by small, organized, and secretive groups of conspirators. After seizing power, this elite group would then use the state authority to establish socialism and rally the masses. The term is often used pejoratively to mean extremists or putschists, implying coups and defeat. Okay. Seems like adventurism and idealism, because any communist movement, any socialist movement is done by the masses. The masses are the ones that do the movement. At proclaiming the revolutionary communism, at the peripheries, however, there are communists who have openly proclaimed their revolutionary communism from the very moment capitalism was declared itself victorious. The Peruvian Communist Party, PCP, launched a people's war in the 1980s. The Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, CPN Maoist, launched a people's war in the late 1990s. The Communist Party of India, Maoist, CPI Maoist, is engaging in people's war now. The Communist Party, the Communist Maoist Party of Afghanistan, CMPA, is planning to launch its own people's war in the near future. The Communist Party of Philippines, CPP, has been carrying out its people's war with setbacks and reinitiations for some time now. In these spaces outside of the academic and intellectual arenas, an arena where our daringness is measured by reclaiming only a name, communism remains a live option in the most forceful and momentous sense. It has not gone away. It is not just a name upon which radical academic career can be built. So while it might seem for those of us who live at the centers of capitalism as if communism has been absent for decades and is only now being reclaimed by our daring new theorists, the fact is that this is simply a mirage. Communism did not bow off the historical stage. It is not only now being renewed by Slavoj Zedek or Alain Badu or Jordi Dean and whoever else has repronounced the word here at the centers of capitalism. The fact is that it renewed itself again in a revolutionary sense in the 1980s, just when capitalism was proclaiming the death of communism and the end of history. But many of us who live in the global metropoles missed this event and even continue to plead ignorance, content to imagine that we can remake history here, that we are reinvent the meaning of communism as we please, ignoring those revolutionary movements that, if we have learned anything from Marx, are responsible for making history. Movements that have the most obvious fidelity to the name and that express this name, even in failed revolutions, are better than our tentative attempts to merely reclaim and re-articulate a word. The word communism remains and will always be proclaimed and reasserted as long as capitalism remains. More than a hypothesis or horizon, communism is a necessity that will never cease being a necessity for the duration of capitalism hegemony. All successes and failures need to be appreciated and even claimed in this context. Because as failures go, there are pools of success to learn from failures. If we understand communism as a necessity, we can comprehend not only the need for its renewal, but reproclamation, but why it cannot simply actualize itself outside of history according to the transhistorical hypothesis and nebulous future horizons. We must speak of a necessary communism grounded in the unfolding of history, a communism that is simultaneously in continuity with and in rupture from the past, a communism that is always a new return against utopianism. Next section. To speak of renewing communism as a necessity is to begin from that point, first opened by Marx and Engels, where the traditions of anti-capitalism was torn from its utopian basis. As Engels wrote in Anti-Düring, that diatribe, which Marx believed as was the best summation of their theory to date. And I think this is Engels or Marx. If the whole of modern society is not to perish, a revolution in the mode of production and distribution must take place, a revolution which will put an end to all class distinctions on this tangible material fact, which is impressing itself in a more or less clear form, but with inseparable necessities on the minds of the exploited proletarians. On this fact, and not on the conception of justice and injustice held by the armchair philosophers in modern socialism, confidence in victory founded. Engels argued, that was Engels. Engels' argument would later be simplified by Rosa Luxemburg to mean socialism or barbarism. That is, either we embrace the possibility of a socialist revolution that could establish communism, or we accept that capitalism is the end of history and thus the fact of barbarism that, quote, modern society is to perish, end quote. Communism then is a necessity because otherwise capitalism, due to its intrinsic logic, will devour existence. And it is senseless to speak of communist horizons in other ways. For what other reasons is there to desire a better world beyond the limits of capitalism? Because capitalism is mean, evil, and immoral. Because we don't like it. There's our questions. These are, as Engels was quick to note at the end of the 19th century, the complaints of armchair philosophers. Abstract moral theorizing cannot escape the problem of contempting class morality and those who attempt to establish a concrete morality that is universal, even when they are not pulling back into the terrain of abstract morality or still incapable of producing revolution. Such justification do not provide a reason to transcend capitalism to speak of any horizons, for they are most often caught within a dialogue of competing moralities. The morality of the oppressor is a continue oppressing, is to continue oppressing. The morality of the oppressed is to revolt, of the oppressed, us, is to revolt. So let me read that again. The morality of the oppressor is to continue oppressing. The morality of the oppressed is to revolt. The only reason why the latter is superior to the former is a reason that must come from outside of this debate. the necessity of revolution due to the fact that the position of the former is, in the last instance, contingent upon the annihilation of the basis of existence, and that the latter, the exploited, the oppressed, the wretched of the earth, make history. I love that. They utilize wretched of the earth. Communism then is more than an ethical necessity. It is a historical and material necessity. Love it. But it is precisely this point of necessity that recent talks of communism, which speaks of hypothesis and horizons, seems to invade. To claim that, quote, another world is possible, after all, is not the same as claiming that another world is necessary, or more accurately, that even this world is unsustainable as it exists now. Another world then becomes necessary if we are to survive and flourish as a species. Instead, we speak of importance of transhistorical hypothesis, or the theoretical significance of the world somewhere over the rainbow. Hence, the immediacies of the communist project, that which speaks of an immense, oh wait, I don't know this word, everybody, hold on. I was so on good. This is so good. I like it so far. Not bad. It looks like it's a menace. They didn't let me do it, but here's the AR overview of the definition. Where's the effects? There it is. I'm gonna have to retake the picture. So a menace is a state of being inherited or existing within something. A theory, it refers to God's experience, presence, and existence. Unlike that cat that pukes. All right, back to it. Imminence of revolution is often ignored. To speak of the communist necessity is to speak precisely of the need of revolution. If we claim that communism is an immediate need, a necessity produced by the logic of capitalism, as Engels suggests, then we should be led to think through the necessary steps that would end capitalism and bring communism into being. A hypothesis is simply a philosophical quandary. A horizon is little more than a fantasy of possibilities, is a useful way of recognizing that the current reality may not be internal, but a necessity is so much more. Communism is necessary, a material need. This tells us what it means to declare fidelity to the name communism. To judge the question of necessity is to judge the need for revolution. To take the question of communism and place it in the stark framework Engels emphasizes it anti-during, though might not seem as sexy as to speak of hypotheses and horizons. Why bother returning to a supposedly, quote, scientific, end quote, statement made by Engels at the end of the 19th century? After all, when the 21st century is upon us, and we need to repopularize communism without recourse to some stodgy or apparently old-fashioned way of looking at the world. But now, with the annihilation of the entire ecosystems, an immediate possibility because of the logic of capitalism, Engels' framing of the question of necessity should be even more striking. Notice he also talks about climate change. The question socialism or barbarism is not a philosophical thought experiment, but a momentous demand. The dream of a possible horizon does nothing to answer the immediacy of this question because it fails to address the problem of necessity. Dreams are like this fantasies projected upon the future and tend to sidestep those real events where there were significant attempts to build the content of these dreams. The thing about real life, unfortunately, is that it never identically resembles the dream. Thus, instead of dreaming about horizons, it is better to recognize that we are currently caught in a dream of capitalism as lucid dreamers in a terrible nightmare. When we recognize that we are in a nightmare, it is waking that becomes the necessity rather than the subordinating ourselves to another fantasy. And yet, to speak of communism as something other than a necessity is an easy way to reclaim the word without reclaiming anything but a vague idea behind the word. It is to intentionally ignore what is needed in the very concrete and material sense. To bring communism into being, hypotheses are things that can be worked out, that require academic investigation. Horizons are points of existence out of sight. Possibilities are open questions. Necessities, however, demand our immediate attention and mobilized practice. Do you hear that? Necessity, however, demands our immediate attention and mobilized practice. The whole reason behind this, the communist necessity. When the movement behind the two great but unsuccessful world historical revolutions of the 20th century recognized that communism was a visceral necessity, they developed theories that spoke to this necessity and that, despite their eventual failures, brought us closer to the possibility of recognizing the hypothesis to breaching the horizons. He's saying that the past revolutions brought us closer to these hypotheses. And these failures are not bad, because when we look at the failures and successes of each revolutions, we take the successes and we try to implement to see if they'll work here. And we discard the failures. Even with the successes that we pull from the pool of failure, we still need to observe that development. The recognition of the necessity of communist revolution, first in Russia, then in China, produced a certain level of revolutionary success that could only lead to the encounter of other necessities. If anything, these moments, whatever their shortcomings, should remind us of the importance of communism and its necessity. We should not hide from these failures, attempt to sidestep them by a vague rearticulation of the terminology, or refuse to grasp that they were also successes. See? If we are to learn from the past through the lens of a necessity and make revolution, then we need to do so with the honesty that treats the practice of making communism as a historical argument. We need to thoroughly go through all the successes and failures of each revolution concretely in order to advance further revolutions, especially here in the Imperial Core. People need to understand this. The problem of movementism. I'm enjoying this. All of these new talks about communism that avoids the necessity of actually bringing communism into being demonstrates a fear of a very name, communism. In this context, one can be a communist in theory, but not necessarily a communist in practice. That's the point. Practice with people that are able-bodied, and people that are not able-bodied still have praxis. Yes, this is a reading. When communism becomes a philosophical problem or even a significant dream, it is no longer vital, and people speaking of its validity are refusing to ask the critical questions that would make communism apparent. The unfocused rebellions that are emerging globally do indeed improve the importance of communism while revealing the limits of the capitalist reality. However, we demonstrate a certain measure of fearfulness over the importance of these rebellions if our suggestions if our suggestions, when we bother to make them, result in tailing the masses, those masses who rebel, whose rebellions are vague enough to be fantastical, and hoping they will magically bring communism into being. The Arabic Spring, which I don't know, which we're going to look up right now. We're going to look up what this means, because he's bringing it up for a second time. So we are going to look this up. I'll be right back, everybody. Let's find out. A little bit of an overview. Was a series of pro-democracy, anti-government protests, uprisings. The armed rebellion, an armed rebellion that spread across much of the Arabic world in the early 2020s. It began in Tanzania and respond to the death of Muhammad, can't say this name, by its immolation. Oh, okay. All right, that makes sense. Effects. Back to here. There we go. Oh, get rid of that. All right, perfect. Occupy the next uprising. Why do we look to these examples as expressions of communism instead of looking at those movements organized militantly under the communist ideology that are making more coherent and revolutionary demands? These are movements that have not forgotten that communism is a necessity, that are not enamored by the rediscovery of a name that only fell out of favor in centers of global capitalism. Those who understand communism as only a hypothesis, a horizon, a possibility, are also those who are incapable of bridging the gap between theory and practice. The act of making communism a reality is generally unpleasant, but so is reality. If we have learned anything from the last two earth-shaking revolutions, it is that bringing communism into being is a messy business. We must remember Mao's aphorism that revolution is not a dinner party, but a tragically violent upheaval in which one class seeks to displace another, and the ruling class the ruling classes we seek to displace will not easily abdicate the historical stage. To speak of communism as a necessity when is to focus on the concrete world and ask what steps are necessary to make it a reality. If the point of necessity is also, as Engels wagered a scientific axiom, which means beginning point, then perhaps it makes sense to treat the process of revolution in the manner of a science, something that is open to the future, that is still in development, while at the same time possessing moments of universalization that have been established through world historical victory, such as like the mass line theory, I'm guessing. Intellectuals at the center of capitalism who are attempting to reclaim the name might give lip services to Rosa Luxemburg's maximum, quote, socialism or barbarism. But what the application of this maximum would mean in practice, that is the question of how to make a necessity of communism a reality, is generally avoided. And so we must ask why these repopularization of communism contained no significant attempts to adequately theorize the steps necessary in any particular context for making communism. If anything, those words, those first world intellectuals engaged in repopularizing communism tend to make a movementist stages and tactics their default practice, placing their faith in disorganized rebellions. They argue either implicitly that we must tell every unfocused mass protest that erupts in response to global capitalism. Do you hear them? They want us to tail behind. We don't tail behind. We don't do commandism as Maoists. There's no tailing back. Even I think even Lenin in one of his things, he talks about tailism and a commandism. Yeah, we don't tail behind. The masses are the ones that bring on revolution. We go along amongst the masses and we do the things. That's what we do as communists. We go amongst them, we teach, we organize, we mobilize, we allow for organic leaderships to produce out of these movements. You know what I mean? Tailing behind, dragging our feet is something we cannot do as Maoists. The argument, though not always stated, is that these protests will through some inexplicable mechanism of combinations produce a revolutionary critical mass at some point on the distant horizon that will finally resolve the communist hypothesis. This is precisely what is now called the movementism. And I can't say that word too well. Sorry, everybody. There was a time in the late 1990s and early 2000s where most of us believed this movementist strategy was synonymous with revolutionary praxis. We went to Seattle to protest the World Trade Organization. We assembled in Quebec City to challenge the free trade agreement of the Americas. We proclaimed that we were part of the beautiful and fragmented chaos of affinity groups, conflicting organizations, disorganized rebels, all of whom were somewhat part of the same social movement that was greater than the sum of its parts. We believed ourselves to be raindrops that would produce a flood capable of sweeping away capitalism. Unwilling to recognize that this was perhaps a false analogy, and that we were more accurately in very concrete terms, a disorganized mob of large plebeians shaking our fist at the disciplined imperial army. Years ago, we spoke of, quote, social movementism. I can't do this. But now it only makes sense to drop the social, since this phrase of confusion was incapable of understanding the social terrain. So while we should endorse every rebellion against capitalism and imperialism, no matter how desperate, as Frantz Fanon once put it, we should also realize that the unfocused nature of these rebellions is intrinsically incapable of responding to the problem of necessity, as the Parti Comunisti Revolutionaries, RCP, argued in its 2006 document, How We Intend to Fight. And this is them. The ruling political tendency has totally assimilated the idea that there is no more unity. For them, social facts are like a bag of marbles that fall on the ground in all directions and with no common trajectory. And they want everybody to think that this is, as a beginning, a normal fact. As a matter of fact, the current situation tells us that many tremble, like Mao said, or they will stumble in the following period, because they refuse to see things in their entirety. They preserve this concept of the bag of marbles and like to see multiplication of trajectories, solutions, possibilities, alternatives, and reform projects. It is a rather accommodating yet ineffective diversity. Nice. This passage concludes, a few paragraphs later that this, quote, this path goes nowhere and will literally be punctured by the facts of the decades to come. Will we overcome this division, or will the bourgeoisie completely crush us? It goes nowhere because, due to its very nature, it cannot approach the point of unity, the point of theoretical and practical totality that the postmodernists warn us to avoid, that should emanate from the understanding that communism is a necessity. For when we speak of necessities, we also have to speak of building and unified movement that, due to this unity, will possess the intention of making that a necessary and what is necessary a reality. Desperate, unfocused, and divided movements lack a unified intentionality. They have proved themselves incapable of pursuing the necessity for communism. Kind of like the liberals are doing with the No Kings protest. Just a bunch of waving your fist and shit. Doing nothing. No trajectory. No praxis. No, like, what do we do when we remove such things? Just a bunch of liberals going out, taking their pictures and saying, look, I did something, instead of actually doing the hard parts, the messy parts. To all the all too easy movementists' solutions, either implicit or explicit in these new endorsements of communism, should be understood as assimilation of an idea of disunity that has indeed become, quote, a normal fact, end quote, at the centers of capitalism. In 2003, the Anti-Globalization Editorial Collective, quote, not notes from nowhere, put together a book called We Are Everywhere that argued, in their quote, different movements around the world are busy strengthening their networks, developing their autonomy, taking to the streets in huge carnivals against capital, resisting brutal repression and growing stronger as a result, and exploring new notions of shared power rather than wielding it. Our voices are mingling in the fields and on the streets across the planet, where seemingly desperate movements, coverage, and the wave of global resistance becomes a tsunami caused by turbulence thousands of miles away, and simultaneously creating ripples which lap at our doorsteps. And back to the text. Lovely words, to be sure. But what happened to the movements? This book documented movement was that were meant to coverage without taking power in an movement of movements, an end to capitalism, from movements of desperate as the EZLN, I think it's the Zapatistas in Mexico, to the Ontario Coalition against Poverty, OCLAP, in Toronto, the disunified terrain in which this book places its hope evaporate within a few years of the book's publication, for it was never really united with a focused intention dedicated to the necessary end of capitalism, dreamlike and carnivalistic. Ooh, I don't know this word. Carnivalesque. Let me find out what this word means. I'm not doing that bad with words. Carnivalesque. My bad. Carnivalesque. Let's go to effects. I'm going to run out of shit. Which means characteristics of a carnival or festival. Lively and okay. That's what he's doing. He's okay. Got it. Effects. And there. All right. Get rid of this. All right. These were movements that might or might not have been important rebellions, but could never produce revolution. It is significant, perhaps, that we are everywhere concludes with a poetic excerpt from Oradontia Roy's Come September speech. Quote, "Another world is not only possible. She is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." End quote. But Roy has transgressed the boundaries of movementism. Today, she spends a great deal of time defending the People's War in India, a revolutionary movement that would have greatly offended the editors of this book and their idealist proclamations of many revolutions without taking power. Roy's shift in strategy is significant because if read in historical context, this chronicle of the previous and failed movementist approach to revolution is an opening of an invitation to a new return to the communist necessity it refused to address. Another downfall of the movementist approach to revolution is that it is incapable, due to the very fact of its disorganization, of producing constant historical memory. For how can we have such a memory if we are focused on incoherence and thus ultimately forgetting? As such, it is only natural that last decade's movementism would be echoed by the still popular movementism of this decade. I can't say the damn word. My lips won't let me. Perhaps it makes sense that the proudly edited and published collection of today's movementisms would also echo the collections of the past movementism. Now we have a book called We Are Many that is focused on the so-called, quote, Arab Spring and the, quote, occupied movements, and generally, oh my gosh, amnesiac about, okay, hold on, I don't know this, is amnesiastic about the fate of the movements. In We Are Everywhere recycles the same tropes, and it is in this general context where we find the odd intellectual speaking of communist hypothesis, possibilities, horizons, a context that remains arrogant to of the preceding context, which was established nothing because it was incapable of accomplishing anything. So why then do those who now speak of communism desire a continuation of this ineffective practice that, at least in the period documented by the quote notes from nowhere, end quote, collective, was wary of uttering this banned name? To go further than simply speak the name is an act of fear and trembling, a terrified remembering of the past experience that we have been told was cataclysmic. Here at the centuries of capitalism, we have inherited a suspicion of a project we have been socialized into believing was nothing more than a totalitarianism, a brutal, quote, animal farm, end quote, that can teach us nothing. So when only the name and not the necessity behind the name is reclaimed, this deficient way of seeing the world is inherited. And from this inheritance, because we do not want to conceptualize a return that will both continue the rupture from these past revolutions, and only practice we can imagine is another articulation of the same movementism that once upon a time was even suspicious of communism. For It is a fearful thing to direct one's self towards actual making communism. Talk is cheap in the face of necessity. Talk that avoids necessity will only lead to the failure, because refusing the conceptualized praxis as something more than philosophical problem, and in this refusal remobilizing the same movementist categories. God, he's killing me with the movementism. Movementist. There we go. We will remain trapped on the abstract level of appearance rather than descending in a concrete realm of necessity. I have no idea who's saying this, but this is a quote. By only sticking to the appearance and subjectivity born out of a given situation, by remaining blind to the totality of the movement, in denying the links of meditation, we give rise to the practice which moves far from the true powers of the struggle. It is a waste. It is a waste. It is as if we refuse to immerse and superb capabilities of the revolutionary struggle. The petite bourgeoisie may be able to ignore and go without this potential, but the proletariat cannot. That is why we say that in the current situations, nothing is more right, useful, and constructive than to struggle for the developing a genuine and common class project. Therefore, we mean to conceive our tools, our methods, and our objectives under the term of conditions of totality and unity. Totality and unity. We have a great need for conceiving this revolutionary struggle. We must carry it out, the interests of the movement as a whole. And carrying out the interests of the movement as a whole, a demand produced by the intentionality of the necessity, is something not errant hypothesis, and no imagined horizon still landlocked within the movementist terrain can be produced. Jesus, I am having problems with the movementist. That's so hard. Great, more of it. Science and necessity. Before examining the phenomenon of movementism in more detail, however, it is worth pausing to think about the word science.
A lot of these problems, like back when
the pale of polite activist discourse. We now live in a time where the word is treated as suspect by many involved in anti-capitalist projects. Woe betide those who could connect it to the word revolutionary and speak of scientific assessments of struggle. There are, of course, liable reasons behind this suspicion. We know how the scientific method and scientific labor have been used by capitalism. We understand the horrors of technologies adopted by military logic, of the vicious and exclusionary nature of the medical industrial complex, of the sciences harnessed by colonial and imperial projects to categorize, control, and dehumanize subject pollutions, of the ways in which science has acted as a discourse to promote the interests of the ruling classes. We rightly mock the scientific gibberish of evolutionary psychology and other biodeterminist nonsense. Decades of critical theory and philosophy has made us cynical. But What has this totalizing cynicism produced? On the one hand, a scornful mistrust of the world's science when it is used to speak of history and social change on the part of those who benefit by living at the centers of global capitalism from the monopoly and scientific advancements. On the other hand, the cautious anti-scientists, scientism and flight back into mysticism that was not only evident in the U.S. hippie movement of the 1960s, but every contemporary collaboration with religious, obscurantism, Jesus Christ. Both rejections of science combined with diverge in every movementist space. Jesus. Often we encounter a suspicion of science premised on the assumption that it is a European dogma, not different from a religion that suppresses the worldviews of those who were Europe's victims. While we should be aware that colonial conquest was in part achieved through a cultural suppression where the spirituality of the colonizer, i.e. Christianity, was treated as rational and perhaps even though wrongly scientific in comparison to the supposed barbaric, quote unquote, spirituality of the colonized, there is a problem with, quote, Europeanizing, Jesus Christ, end quotes, Europeanizing science as a whole. Here, science is treated as a colonial practice of spirituality, the business of the colonized. The latter may even be fantasized, and in this fetishism, appropriated in the most racist, though explicit sense of the term. Assuming that science is something invented, quote unquote, by Europeans, however, is to erase all the scientific practices and discoveries of those peoples European colonialism genocided and colonized, stealing and claiming scientific discoveries in the process. He's going over the fact that they stole all this shit. So fucking awesome. I don't know who that is. Sorry, it's a reading. If we are to reclaim the immediacy of communism as a necessity, then we must also reclaim the conceptual meaning of science. In this crudest sense of scientific advancement and technological instruments, this fact should be obvious. Capitalism possesses a monopoly over those technologies that are capable of maintaining social control, guns, tanks, drones, etc. We will not topple this brutal system through meditation of any sort, let alone our moral and spontaneous will to, quote, speak truth to power, end quote, in innumerable demonstrations where the state's police and military are better prepared than the average protester. Here I go. I'm going to try to say this word again. Movementism was already produced a mythology with struggle that would lead us to believing otherwise, a moralism that runs counter to reality. Wishful thinking that if we were all out in the streets, all spontaneously producing an insurrection, the state's technological machines will refuse to initiate a bloodbath. Let us go deeper into this problem, though, so as to think the possibility of scientific thought. To reclaim the concepts of science is more than simply recognizing the efficacy of instruments. It concerns anti-capitalist theory itself. And to argue that there is such a thing as revolutionary science is even bolder than arguing for the necessary recognition of the scientific instruments monopolized by the ruling class. Here is a totalizing assumption. Science should find its home in the heart of theories, of organization and strategy, because science, the only thing capable of generating facts and truth, is superior to non-science. What do we mean then by science? In the previous sections, I briefly discussed how science is open to the future, a process in development that produces, through historical struggles, universal truths, that is, facts that are applicable to every particular context, though also mediated by these contexts. Although science is often defined in popular discourse as the empirical method utilized by those disciplined that we are educated to understand as properly scientific, such a definition is about as useful as saying biology is biology or chemistry is chemistry, and ignores the logical basis that makes these disciplines different from non-scientific theoretical terrains. The empirical method is indeed important and is a significant tool for establishing truth in particular scientific disciplines. But to reduce the definition of science to empiricism results in positivism, which is precisely what many of us have learned to suspect whenever the word science is spoken. Let's look at positivism. What is let's look at empiricism first. We're going to look at empiricism first, everybody. No, come on, highlight the right word. Thank you. Let's look at empiricism. All right, empiricism. And then we're going to look up another word, empiricism. The theory, hold on, come on. The theory that all knowledge is derived from a sense experiences, stimulated by the rise of experimental science. It developed in the 17th century, 18th century, expounding in particular by John Locke. Okay. All right, now we're going to look up positivism. Let's go look up that. Whatever. And of course, it gave me the AI overview, so it's better than nothing. Do effects, enter, boom. All right. So positivism is a philosophical and scientific approach that maintains all genuine knowledge, is the basis of on observable empirical evidence and scientific methods. All right. Go back to effects and go all the way down here. There we go. Back to the book. All right. The empirical methods is indeed important and is a significant tool of establishing truth in particular scientific disciplines. But to reduce the definition of science to empiricism results in positivism, which is precisely what many of us have learned to suspect whenever the word science is spoken. Science is that which speaks of material conditions without mystification. Science provides a natural explanation of natural phenomena. Physics is a physical explanation of physical phenomenon. Biology is a biological explanation of biological phenomenon. Chemistry is a chemical explanation of chemical phenomenon. And historical materialism is a historical / social explanation of historical social phenomena. Why then is historical materialism a revolutionary science? Because the historical social explanation of historical social phenomena is very mechanism of class struggle, of revolution. And this scientific hypothesis is that which is capable of demystifying the whole of history, a myriad of societies, a way in which to gauge any and every social struggle capable of producing historical change. Hence, without a scientific understanding of social struggles, we are incapable of recognizing when and where failed theories manifest. The physicist has no problem banning Newtonian speculation to the past where it belongs. He or she possesses a method of assessment based on the development of a specific scientific terrain. If we resist a similar scientific engagement with social struggles, we have no method to make sense of the ways in which revolutionary hypotheses have been proven in a historical crucible due to historical, quote, experiments of class struggle. To reject a scientific understanding of struggle is to assert that these past experiments, the complete failures and half successes and half failures, have failed to establish anything significant. And so we are doomed to successive attempts of directionless reinventions. A scientific understanding of struggle, however, teaches us about the theoretical terrain of struggle that has been persistent by history through humanity's past endeavors and is still open to the future, which social struggles establish. Oh my God, hold on a second. I forgot, I was getting into this book, my bad. Hold on a second. All right, we're gonna, this is the last part. I was getting into this book, the time went by so fast. Yeah, my fault, everybody. Let me get, a scientific understanding of struggle, however, teaches us about the theoretical terrain of struggle that has been present by history through humanity's past endeavors and is still open to the future, which social struggles establish new truths due to marginal but universalizable successes. Universalizable successes. He uses big words. Which successive social struggles learned from these past establishments of truth and went a little further before also meeting failure. How then do we apply what has been scientifically proven as these social experiments to our particular circumstances so as to go even further? These are questions that can only be asked if we have the meter of science to gauge our practice, thus demanding at every moment of struggle an attention of necessity. Without such an understanding of reality, we have no ways of making sense of our practice. We might as well forget the past, act as if everything is particularly unique, and ignore every movement when the repetition of failure ought to be treated as obvious. Movementism receives its strength in this grand project of forgetting. And that's where we're starting, because next is Puritanism. This is good. So what it needs to do is, like, what they're saying is, oh my gosh, it won't let me highlight, won't even let me do tell me it will let me at least do this. Oh no, it won't even let me do a bookmark? Are you kidding me? Not even a bookmark. It won't even let me do a bookmark. God damn it. So we ended on page 26. Underneath Puritanism. And we're going to look up that word tomorrow. All right? I'm going to write this down. Yeah, like we don't want that anymore. We want it to be full form plunge, and we want it to let everybody to understand it. And like he mentioned it in the past that there's failures and there were successes. Observe the failures, observe why the failures, and observe what was successful. And seeing those things can be put to our material conditions, such as mass lying theory that Mao did, and that Mao did during the Chinese Revolution, and that was procured now ultimately. So like our job is to study revolutions, to study them completely, and to use each other as we study these things in order to engage in what we need to do here through practice. So that's important for us to learn what scientific methods are needed and everything. And what are we going to do? You know what I mean? Like I would say that I have drawn back to, maybe I am, I'm not backwards. I'm not advanced. I don't think I'm an advanced, honestly. I think I'm still learning a lot about Marxism and stuff like that. In a lot of things, there's so much to learn. There's no way I can be an absolute, like, in my realm, an absolute, like, intellectual Marxist, because it's a lot, and I'm still learning how to study, and I'm still learning how to comprehend things when it comes to reading. So I still have a bunch to go with, you know what I mean? But oh, look, it's Vaughn. Hey Vaughn, you missed it. We made it to page 26. That is underneath, I forgot where it's at. Where's it at, Joe? I don't know. But this is a Maoist reading. The Communist Necessity is a Maoist reading by this person named Jane Melford Paul. He developed a book. He wrote a book called Continuity and Rupture, which really drew the distinction of why I'm a Maoist and why the rupture from Marxist-Leninism ruptures into Maoism. So yeah. Don't worry, read up to 26 if you want to. If you have time tonight, read up to 26, and then you'll be caught up. If you want to. So, really good book so far. Yeah. Yeah, we also have YouTube too. So, yeah. So you're welcome to also listen to it too. But yeah, but catch up with us. This is a good book. This is a Maoist reading. This dude's a Maoist and stuff. So, very good book. It's called The Communist Necessity. Why communism is a necessity. So, really good. But does anybody have any questions, wants to come up? Yeah, it's a good book. Good book so far. Good book. But does anybody have any questions or anything? Yeah. I think it's underneath the communist section, or it could be under the Maoist section. Either the communist section or the Maoist section. I can't remember. But real quick, I'll go look here real quick. 26. Let me go look real quick for you. If you're still here. Let me go look. Where is there it is. Do. That's not it. Come on. Let's go down to communism. I'm looking it for you. Yep. Oh wait, no, that's kids and yeah, it's underneath communist books. It's the second one up if you're interested. Second one up. You came in a little late too. Get to Sebastian. Yeah, no worries. Sebastian, communist section, demystifying leftism. Second one up, called Communist Necessity. All right, that's what you got. All right. All right. All right. Well, if no one has anything to say, I'll go ahead and close it down.